Hello out there in YouTube land. Last week I published part 1 of the King's Fine Woodworking Flagship Table Saw Sled unboxing and assembly videos. That video covered the complete unboxing and all of the assembly of the table saw sled itself. If you haven't watched that video yet, I will post a link to it in the comments, as well as links to the original King's Fine Woodworking videos. Today I'm bringing you part 2, which will cover the assembly of the picture frame jig and the miter function jig. So with that said, let's begin with the assembly of the picture frame jig. The first thing I did was to make myself some setup blocks out of some scrap 3/4 inch plywood. These are just cut to match the depth of the kerf cut into the picture frame stop block and the depth of the bottom of the stop block, which is a 3/8 inch depth of the plywood used. This may not make a lot of sense right now, but at a minute you'll see where I use these. I cut 3 of them, but I really only needed 2. I just made 1 extra. I'm not saying this is the only way or even the best way to set up the picture frame ruler. This is just the way I did it. When you get your picture frame ruler, you're going to want to cut a 45-degree angle off the end of the ruler. Now, I tried to be as precise as I possibly could at making that cut at exactly the 0 end of the ruler, but if you're off by a little bit, it really won't matter all that much. So I carefully marked where I wanted to make that cut, and I went over to my little battery operated miter saw to make the cut. Now I have a big miter saw I could have used for this, but I tell you what, this little battery operated miter saw just did a great job of cutting through that ruler. I was really impressed with that. Next, I put the picture frame jig onto the table saw sled with the handles and the T-tracks and made sure it was held flush against the back fence. I used a carpenter's square to make some pencil lines, which I'm going to use as reference lines for attaching the square in a minute. You just want to make sure you're square against the fence and you're marking at exactly the apex of the triangle at the top. So then I just put some double-sided tape on the back of the carpenter's square, and I stuck it down on top of the picture frame jig. This is why I had made those reference lines with pencil, so that I would know where I wanted to put that carpenter's square once I got the double-sided tape on it. Now I'm going to mark where the ruler will go, and you'll see why I made those setup blocks. You want the ruler to be exactly parallel to the end of the plywood, the same distance as the kerf cut into the stop block, and you want the 45-degree angle at the end of the ruler to be flush against the carpenter square. So when you have that geometry established and you know where you want your ruler, you can tape it down and use a self-centering bit to mark the screw holes. Now, I also should have mentioned you want to remove the front fence and the removable insert from the back fence before you do this step. Now, because I have a saw stop and I don't want that ruler close to my saw blade, I'm going to go back over to my Mighty Mini miter saw and cut some more off the end of the ruler. I cut it down to about the 1/4 inch mark this time. And I'm just going to take a minute to sand off those pencil lines I made earlier. I don't need those pencil lines anymore. And also, because I have no desire to slice off a finger, I'm going to file off the ends of the cut that I made in the ruler so that I don't have any sharp edges to worry about. And now you can just screw the ruler down into the screw holes that you made in the previous step. I already marked where I wanted to drill the holes to attach the toggle clamp to the stop block. So I'm just going to drill those holes into the stop block, and then I will screw the toggle clamp down to the stop block. And with that, you can put your stop block onto the ruler using the toggle clamp, and your picture frame jig is essentially finished. Except for one problem I ran into, which we'll get into right now. So this was my problem. When I went to remove the picture frame jig from the table saw sled, that's when I noticed the screws I used were too long and I had screwed the whole thing onto the sled. Oops. I had used the screws supplied in the kit, and I really didn't even pay attention to the fact that they were too long. That was my fault. Now, I could have just run down to the hardware store and gotten the proper screws, but this happened to be the last weekend before Christmas, and the last thing I wanted to do was deal with traffic and no parking and people peopling. So I decided to just get out the Dremel and grind the backs of the screws so they were flush with the plywood. Now, I want to make sure to emphasize, I called James and told him what happened, and I asked him, do you want me to show this in my video? And he said, yes, of course. We want to show the good and the bad, warts and all. And if there's a problem, how to fix it. And he wants to know if there's ever any problem with something you purchase from him, he wants you to contact him and he will take care of it. So here we are, and I'm grinding off the backs of those screws. On to the assembly of the miter function jig. This did not come pre-drilled, so I used the plans, which gave me the exact measurement for drilling a 1/4 inch hole for the handle which fits into the T-track. This was 3.5 inches up from the bottom and 6 1/8 inch over from the right. The plans also give measurements for cutting a mitered angle off the top right corner. This does not need to be as precise as the 1/4 inch hole, but I went ahead and used the measurements provided in the plans. And I drilled my 1/4 inch hole. And then went over to the miter saw and cut off that top right corner. Next, you want to attach the digital angle finder to the top of the plywood jig. I have double-sided tape on the back, and I'm using my scrap plywood so that I have a straight edge to butt the angle finder up against. The end of the digital angle finder has to be on the same plane as the edge of the plywood jig and flush with the top edge. Then you can use a self-centering bit to drill the holes and you can screw it down. While I'm doing that, this is a good time to talk about precision, accuracy, and repeatability. This miter function jig, while it can be very accurate, is not meant to replace something like an Incra Miter 5000. I know there are many aftermarket miter gauges out there. I'm not familiar with them all. I have an Incra Miter 1000 and I will continue to use that when I want a high degree of precision, accuracy, and repeatability. That's not the purpose of this jig. This is useful, however, when you want maybe a quicker way to make a miter cut. And there is no doubt it can be very accurate. It's just not meant to replace your Incra. Next, you want to attach the miter function blade to the top of the digital angle finders. So I have double-sided tape again, and I'm making sure it's flush with the end of the digital angle finder ruler, and sticking it down with the double-sided tape. And then screwed that on. Then you want to attach the other miter function blade to the first miter function blade. I'm using some CA glue and some activator. I'm going to hold it up against there so that I can make sure it's perfectly perpendicular to the first one. And I'm just going to stick a couple of pin nails in for good measure. And with that, you can put the handle on it, put it in the T-track, and your miter function jig is complete. So that completes the assembly of the picture frame jig and the miter function jig. As always, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my videos.